it to my talk. I'm honored to be here. I know some of you might be a little bit tired, so I appreciate you making the effort to come in. I left a little bit early, but I noticed that some of you are quite the dancers. I did not know that about our community. That's pretty cool. You're out here looking like the Finnish Prime Minister dancing around. It's great stuff. Well done. So I'm Adarsh Pandit. I'm from California in the United States. And today I'm going to talk about the technical and organizational infrastructure of our Ruby community, which is to say I'm going to cover critical projects of Ruby World, how they work, who supports these projects, things like that. Many people this week have been making reference to Ruby and Rails thriving for 100 years. And this is my guess at how we might be able to accomplish that. So I'm so excited to be here in Finland. This is my first time being here. It's such a beautiful city. It's really easy to get around, and the food is delicious. It's just been a great experience. I also like how it's a bit of a contradiction. It's supposed to be the happiest place on Earth, but also has the angriest music, maybe? So today's goals for our talk today, first, we're going to learn a little bit more about Ruby infrastructure systems on which we all depend on, some of us daily. And in this talk, I'm going to expand the definition of infrastructure. I'm going to include some more things that you might not necessarily think of, not just servers and code and network capabilities, but things that are really important that hold all of us together as a community. Second, I'm going to inspire you, hopefully, to get involved with the Ruby community and Ruby infrastructure, or at the very least, inspire or maybe push a little bit to get your organizations to be contributors to our community. And third, I'm going to talk about bikes. So what's the reason for this? Why are we covering this material? We depend on so many things without knowing how they work, or who works on them, or what keeps them functioning. We especially don't think about who's doing the work or how these projects are run. This is a kind of paradox. We don't need to care about what happens when we run bundle exec and we load our packages when we're doing our development, because when the infrastructure is done properly, it feels invisible. It's like it always has been there and it always will be there. But everything comes to a screeching halt when things like that don't work. So that's why I feel like these are important things to talk about. And if you remember anything from my talk, this is really the point. I'm going to try and hit this several times, which is that someone has to build and maintain the infrastructure of our community, and it might be you. And also, someone has to pay for building and maintaining our infrastructure in our community, and that also might be you and your company. So a little bit about my work life. I'm a Ruby developer since 2011 and a consultant. I've been a director with Ruby Central and Ruby Together for 6 years. Ruby Central, some of you may have heard of it. It's a nonprofit which supports Ruby infrastructure. We organize RubyConf and RailsConf every year when we can, pandemic notwithstanding. And we also pay for a lot of our shared open source infrastructure, including Bundler and Ruby Gems. We support lots of other smaller projects, but those are really the main ones that we work on. I want to put a quick plug in here for RubyConf and RubyConf Mini, both of which are happening in a few weeks. They're going to be super cool and a lot of fun. Get your tickets now. Why two RubyConfs? Many of our attendees can't travel to Texas because of safety concerns. And Gemma, who's gave a great talk yesterday and who's up here in the front row, has done a ton of work to organize another way for those folks to be part of the RubyConf experience. So definitely look those up, and if you can attend, it'd be great to see you there. A bit about my non-work life. I love bicycles. At the beginning of the pandemic, this is sort of a recent thing. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I started cycling, and it's become a really deep affection and love. I was homeschooling my 2 small kids, like many of us parents were. And pretty quickly, I realized that I needed some kind of outlet for my mental health. I bought a road bike to get exercise, to get outside, and to be able to socialize in a COVID-safe environment. And I got really into it, and nowadays, I ride a few thousand kilometers every year. This is a picture of me riding on a charity ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles, which is about 500 miles, or I think 800 kilometers. I ride for fun, but I also take my kids to school. These are my kids. On this e-bike, which is specially designed for the purpose. My wife took this photo of us on the day of my younger one's first day of school in kindergarten. And this is just really a special time when we get to go to school together like this. But when you ride around on a bicycle with your kids, the first thing you start to think about is safety. And it becomes top of mind, and you think a lot more about how the world around you could be a lot more safe for your children. And since I started taking my kids to school this way, I became very aware of the road infrastructure of our town, where I live in Oakland, California. So today I'm going to talk about infrastructure in two parts. Excuse me. I'm going to bring together two things that I think are really important for me, but also for all of us here in this room, which is bicycle infrastructure and Ruby infrastructure. Hopefully I can help us all understand what leads to good infrastructure and how that can improve all of our lives here. Now, the way that I look at things with a view towards infrastructure is really radically impacted by this book, Thinking in Systems, by Donella Meadows. And to clarify, I am not an expert on systems thinking. I'm sure many of you know a lot more about it than I do, and I'd love to talk about it and learn from you afterwards. But I did learn a lot from this book. She wrote this book in the 90s, but died in 2001, which is very unfortunate. Her colleagues edited her manuscript and then published it for her in 2008. It's really a shame that she didn't see it published, because it's really just such a great book, in my opinion. But she summarizes her thesis like this. The central concept is that systems behaviors are not caused by exogenous events, but rather are intrinsic to the system itself. And that's kind of a mouthful, and there's another way of thinking about that, which is the purpose of a system is what it does. The purpose of a system is what it does. The outcome of it is the purpose of the system. In this view, when we look at unexpected outcomes in the world, sometimes you might hear yourself or others say, the system is broken. In the United States, some people say the election systems are broken. Or in my town, I often say the transit systems are broken. But no system is truly broken. What it does is its purpose by definition. We might not like what it's doing, but that's its purpose. And if a system is not doing what we want it to do, we have to understand it, get involved, and redesign it. I'm going to be talking a lot about systems, so let's really just kind of define it quickly. For me, a system is a bunch of things which interact with each other to form a whole. It's a little bit broad because there's all kinds of different systems. For example, right here at this conference, we have an AV system, which is allowing you to see my slides and hear my voice. There's a heating system going on, which keeps us all from freezing. There are lunch systems set up by the organizers, which help us get diet-appropriate food. There's coffee delivery systems, which keep you awake during this talk. Thank you for that one. Computer programs, of course, are complex systems, so they're assemblies of subsystems. There's the application itself, the database, the offline queuing. All of it works together toward one purpose. Let's look at some other examples. This is Oulu. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm sorry if I'm not. Oulu, Finland. This is about 600 kilometers north of us in central Finland. It's a town of about 200,000 people. And the temperatures are below freezing 6 months out of the year, even during the day. It's very cold. It is considered also to be the winter cycling capital of the world, and I want to tell you why. This is a protected bicycle and pedestrian path, part of a network of almost 900 kilometers of these paths. These paths are shared between cyclists and pedestrians. But the signs on the road, painted on the road here, are invisible once it snows. And the cyclists kept colliding with the pedestrians. And the city designers thought to themselves, how can we solve this problem? So they built these street lamp-looking things, which you can see up here on the left, to project the signage down onto the snow. They also take the snow and they collect it and mix it with gravel and pound it down to make like kind of this more firm, straight road. I should note in Finland, winters are very dark, so this works very well for most of the day. So in this town in January, for example, you get about 4 hours of daylight between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So then what is the purpose of this transportation system? We can look at the result of the system, which is that even though it's freezing for half of the year, 22% of all trips in this town are taken by bicycle, even despite the temperature, by people of all ages. This is a school in the same town. This school has 1,200 students. On this particular day, the high temperature was -17 C, or 1 degree Fahrenheit. When this picture was taken, 1,000 kids came to school on bicycles out of 1,200, which is over 80%. Imagine all the things that needed to be in place for this to happen safely, for all the parents in this town to let their kids ride their bikes to school. This system is designed to allow kids to safely bike to school regardless of the weather. This is Tampere, another town in Finland. Again, I'm so sorry if I'm butchering these pronunciations. And this is a road that's been redesigned between 1998 and 2022. And so let's examine some of the differences between these two pictures. So on the left, we see a lot of cars, and on the right, we see a lot of other things happening. And this looks a lot more like maybe what we see outside here in Finland today. So we see trams and tram tracks. We see a lack of cars. It's in fact very hard to see a car in this picture. We see the appearance of bicycles and pedestrians. People are walking around here. There's a cyclist here on the left. And to me, there's two really striking things about this. Number one, there's a lot more ways to get around. Instead of on the left, there's really kind of one, maybe two. There's a bus here in the background. And on the right, there's a lot more options for how to get from place to place. So let's ask, what's the purpose of this system? The purpose of this system, in my view, is to move lots of people on the roadways as safely as possible, however they want to travel. This is Finland. This is a bike tour that I took on Wednesday morning. This is my guide. His name is Jari. He used to be a bike messenger, and now he's an ornithologist. And you can notice here on the left, there's a line of parked cars that serves as a barrier, as well as this curb here that separates the moving traffic from the bike path. It's building fault tolerance into the system. We don't have to ask the drivers to avoid us as cyclists. They really don't have an option to do us much damage. And also, this is a great example of a lovely autumn day here in Helsinki. So we can kind of just watch this and have a little moment of zen. If you get a chance to rent a bicycle, there's a great bike share program here. You should definitely rent a bike and ride around. Excuse me. This is what biking is like where I live. This is Camino Pablo Road near my house in California. I very regularly ride on this road, and I don't think twice about it until I came here. The bike lane is this, let's see, I have a laser, this narrow strip of pavement right here. And it's delineated by this kind of cracked white paint on that side there. The lane merging in off the right is an off-ramp from this freeway overpass. You can see the freeway is up there, and the exit ramp comes around, and then the cars come off this way onto this road. The angle of the lane is not designed for cars to slow down. They're coming off the freeway very quickly, and they continue to go very fast as they come onto this road and merge together. This is obviously very dangerous for cyclists. However, this system is not broken. It is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is to allow cars to go as fast as possible. Actually, a funny thing happened while I was doing research and scrolling the internet. I was personally attacked by this meme. In fact, this looks almost identical to the road that I ride on very regularly, although it's even better than the one that I have. It's got better paint, and it's got a picture and a nice green lane there. So this was humbling. So what are the outcomes of these two systems? What's the result? Here in Finland, investment in the transportation systems, including transit, cycling, and even car infrastructure, has completely eliminated pedestrian and cyclist deaths. In 2019, for the first time, no pedestrians or cyclists died as a result of traffic accidents. In the US, we tolerate 850 bicycle deaths and 47,000 injuries a year. Those are 2019 numbers. It's definitely gone up. We tolerate 6,000 pedestrian deaths and 76,000 injuries and 40,000 driver deaths. Most of those are drivers colliding with other drivers. 40,000 people. So the purpose of the Finnish transport system is to eliminate deaths as well as to get people to where they want to go, however they want to get there. What's the purpose of the US transit system? This is the impact of the lack of safe roads. And I put both of these together to contrast, for contrast. This is data, again, from 2019. This is per capita road deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. There are, of course, lots of factors at play here. I'm not going to list them all, but there's a lot going on here, and it is very striking. But to me, the different system purposes are pretty clear. In the US, the roads are designed to move cars quickly. And in Europe, the roads are designed to move people quickly and safely. But how did this come about? How did this difference arrive? How did Finland achieve such a different outcome than other countries? Why is the transportation system here so different? So I'm going to read this slide, even though everybody says you never do that. For the last 50 years, all fatal crashes and some non-fatal ones have triggered the formation of a multidisciplinary accident assessment panel. The panels are funded through revenue collected from auto insurance premiums, and their membership includes experts in traffic planning, human behavior, law enforcement, and healthcare. Following its investigation, each panel releases a public report with recommendations. Helsinki officials say that the findings regularly lead to policy changes, such as adjusting road geometry and changing traffic lights. So let's break down the pieces of this that are important. After a crash in Helsinki, a new group is created to investigate and look into the root causes. The people involved come from lots of different disciplines. They attack the problem from a lot of different angles. It is funded by the auto users, who are the source of the problem. And the results are public. And most importantly, the results lead to change in the system. They apply the learnings. If this sounds familiar, by the way, this might sound a lot like a blameless postmortem that you might have experienced. By contrast, in the US, we do this kind of multidisciplinary investigation for airplane crashes, but not for car crashes. There is very little priority for making streets safer, either for the driver or the people outside the car. Mostly the government blames the driver. In 2013, they released this chart that said that 94% of crashes are due to drivers. This system avoids discussing how deadly cars can be by blaming the people driving them instead of poor road design. So why do the Finns have better streets and safer streets than in the United States? What leads to this difference? In my opinion, the difference is governance. For me, governance is how a system is managed. It's all the boring stuff. It's committees, reports, meetings, documentation, onboarding, research, and so on. But in this case, the boring stuff is saving lives. Okay, this is a Ruby conference. Why is this guy talking about cycling and street design? I believe the same things that make Finland one of the safest places to bicycle can also make our programming community flourish. Things like transparency and documentation, competent advisory boards, setting goals, aligning strategies, accountability, checks and balances, ethics and integrity, values, things like that. In short, all of these things that comprise governance. So let's look at the important parts of Ruby World and ask about governance. For me, these are the essential parts of Ruby World. Your mileage may vary. This is just an example and hoping to start a conversation. There's Ruby, the language itself, and again, for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to talk about MRI. There's Rails and other frameworks. There's gems and libraries, package management. There's community, which is kind of an umbrella term I'm using to include conferences like this, meetups, online spaces, things like that. and Learning World, which is tutorials, videos, books, boot camps, Q&A sites, things like that. I'm going to say that these 6 elements comprise the big pieces that make Ruby World as good as it is. And if you remove any one of these pieces, writing software with Ruby gets much harder, less productive, and a lot less fun. So let's ask some questions about how these are governed. For each project, I'm interested in 3 areas. Number 1, who's doing the work? Number 2, how are the decisions made? And number 3, who pays for the work? Before I go on, I have a lot of caveats. First, this talk has a lot more questions than it has answers. But we should be talking about project health and how we can improve it. Second, I expect to be corrected, probably online, hopefully politely. I want to highlight that some of these answers are not clear, and some are, and that's okay. There's a lot of work to be done, but all of us can do it together. I've also left out a number of projects here. I'm not trying to erase anybody, but 30 minutes is a lot less time than you think. And when I ask for transparency here, I'm not trying to call anybody out or really imply any kind of negative or embarrassing or nefarious intent. Rather that I'm saying that transparency creates accountability and participation, which in turn creates more durable systems and can get us to that 100-year mark. Much like Mats was saying in his keynote, I want the Ruby community to last for a very long time. Let's start with MRI Ruby. Who does the work? Or rather, let's ask who's on the core team. According to this page on the Ruby language website, which is titled Ruby Core, I don't know. Mats is mentioned here, but the core team is not listed. I have a sense from, and I think many of us do, of who the core team really is. You can tell from the GitHub contributor graph. You can tell from conversations and other talks, but there really isn't anything official listed up here. It would be cool to see it listed. How are decisions made in Ruby? Conversations are generally public in the bug tracking system. Many of you have participated or seen this before. Anyone can read and follow along. Decisions of record seem to happen here in the bug tracker. Also, there are regular dev meetings. I'm not sure if anybody knew that. There are guidelines for these dev meetings. There are processes in place. And there are considerations for language barriers for this very international project, where a good number of the contributors are from Japan. There are minutes from these meetings, which are in this repository, dev meeting log. If you read it, you can tell that Mats is ultimately the decision maker for Ruby's design. I don't think that's really a big surprise to most of us here. Excuse me. Often this governance model is referred to as the BDFL model, or the benevolent dictator for life, although he has hinted previously at retiring. So how is governance in MRI overall? What do we think of all this? I actually think it's pretty good. If we look at the result of the system, it has been consistent, steady progress of the language over many years. Ruby 3 is way better than Ruby 2. Certainly some risk mitigation is needed, maybe a succession plan, some other things, who knows. But I believe it's gone really well with this level of governance. And I think it's because of the original mission of Ruby, which is programmer happiness. I think that the focus on user enjoyment has benefited decision making. It serves as kind of a North Star for the goals and the values of the project. It would, of course, be super cool to see all that spelled out on the website, but for now, everything seems pretty good. Who pays for Ruby development? I don't know. That's why I put this tiny question mark here. Or rather, I don't know confidently enough to tell you from this stage. There's a lot of half answers on the internet. As we saw in the keynote, Mats thanked a number of supporters, different companies and organizations. But it would be nice to know in one place who supports Ruby, and I think we could put that on the website too. By the way, here's a fun intersection of the two main topics of this talk. If you can't read it in the back, it says, I thought I knew what anxiety felt like, and then I watched half the Python core dev team try to cross a busy street at the same time. Let's look at Rails real quick. Who does the work? The Rails team has done a really good job of laying out who works on the project and who the decision makers are. There's a defined hierarchy with 3 teams. There's the core team, the committer team, and the issues team. How can you become somebody who does the work? There's a really good guide for new contributors in Rails guides. Has anybody read this or participated in making it better? Raise your hand. Thank you. You should definitely check this out. I definitely recommend everybody look at it, even if you don't think you're going to contribute. How are decisions made? There's been a recent movement toward establishing formal governance in Rails. There was a blog post that was titled Rails Governance, which is great. And in May of last year, that's when this post was released by the Rails team. There's not a ton of detail in there, but it's a great start, and it does say this very important thing. No one person runs the show. It's a team effort, which is great to know. In my opinion, this is a huge step in the right direction, and it reduces a lot of risk. This past spring, core team member Eileen Ushatel gave a great talk at RailsConf. I was lucky enough to be there to watch it happen. It was hugely instructive and provided much more detail about governance than even in that post. This is a big step forward. She announced how people move between the teams, how contributions are evaluated, that there's a new public Discord server, so more transparency in the conversation. But especially she talked about the goal of making contributing to Rails easier for new people. Eileen deserves a ton of credit for advancing governance in Rails. And I think if you have a chance, you should definitely watch this talk. It's well worth your time. Who pays for Rails development? It seems like these companies pay for people to work on Rails, but this is not a complete list or an official list. This is just things that I've heard or maybe remember from the last 11 or 12 years of doing Ruby development. Companies like Spotify have been really generous in giving grants to us at Ruby Central to improve security. Support like that benefits everybody. Shopify, for example, understands that we all benefit from increased security. It helps the entire community. The Shopify folks have told us at Ruby Central, hey, do whatever you need. You guys know best. And they've been really great. And it's been super cool to work with them and have their support. We look forward to sharing some of those results in the future. But even though supporters of open source have paid for work which benefits all of us so far, and our relationships have been really great, do we want to put protections on how money influences development? If so, what does that look like? I don't really have any answers, but I think that these are important questions. And I also think, more importantly, that I think we should ask these questions before we have the problems instead of afterwards. And I will say this, given the recent governance in Rails and this trend, I have a lot of hope that these things will be worked out by us as a community. Let's talk about Bundler really quick, our package management system. Since it's near Halloween, I'm going to tell a quick spooky tale. Some of you may remember it. Back in 2013, in January, around the time that I started writing Ruby professionally, Ruby gems got hacked. Does anybody remember this? Raise your hand. How did this happen? This gem manifest got uploaded for a gem cleverly called exploit. It took advantage of a YAML execution vulnerability. And if you look at the code here, you can see what it does. It looks up config files containing secret keys and sends them to a paste bin site. So really, it just exposes all the passwords for the Ruby gem server. The maintainers discovered this and shut the site down to protect everybody while they tried to restore an earlier safe version of the state. Excuse me. The result was that Ruby gems went down and no one could bundle their gems. This outage lasted for a few days, 2-3 days, something like that. This meant that all Ruby development around the world stopped. The people who maintained Ruby gems did their best to try and get the site back up and ensure the exploit was removed and that no other gems were tampered with. It was a huge amount of work that had to be done all of a sudden. One of the maintainers posted this update to the Orange website to explain the situation. I want to share this to highlight an important failure point. This was a hobby for the maintainers in 2013. They were doing this in their spare time. When you look at the root cause analysis of why this happened, the answer is clear. People were not getting paid to do this. It wasn't a priority for them. Worse yet, this exploit was known about for a few days before this hack happened. But nobody had the time or energy to work on it because they had other paying jobs and responsibilities. In 2013, there were huge companies working on making lots of money using Ruby and Rails infrastructure, and our infrastructure was volunteer run. It's really surprising that something like this didn't happen sooner. Remember, the system didn't break. The system ended up with poor design from neglect and functioned as intended because people weren't being supported to do this work. So what happened since then? Ruby Together was created to try and find a way to pay people to work on these critical projects. It was not perfect, But since its formation, there have been no more outages like in 2013. And that was the purpose of this system, is to prevent that from happening again. And I think, in my view, I think it was pretty successful. I've been a board member of this organization since early days. And I think we on the board did a pretty good job of governance. We did as best as we could as volunteers. It was better than it not existing, for sure. And a lot of open source work was supported financially. And eventually, we merged this into Ruby Central. So back to Bundler. Who does the work? The people on the site do the work. Who makes the decisions? Everything's in GitHub issues, and they use a consensus model like other projects. And who pays for it? About 60%, 70% of the funding comes from Ruby Central, and the rest is volunteer labor from the contributors. Excuse me. In terms of our languages libraries, the picture is a lot fuzzier. Who does the work? Well, lots of people. Who makes decisions? Mostly it's solo maintainers. And if they're lucky, they have a co-collaborator who can help out on a volunteer basis. Who pays for the work? There isn't really a good way for people to get paid enough to maintain their gems full time. There's great patronage mechanisms like GitHub sponsors, which work really well, but aren't used frequently enough for people to work full time on these libraries. I'm not sure what the solution is here, but I think it's an important question. Community. This is a broad brush category, and so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. But these projects and events are the glue that holds the rest of it together. Conferences like this one, meetups, online communities, newsletters, podcasts, Rails-oriented camping weekends where there's no internet, all of that stuff helps us all find each other as a community. And learning world. This looks a lot like the community world. Projects include things like tutorials, videos, books, boot camps, and Q&A sites. There's some money in it, but usually not enough to support yourself. You can advance your career and create a better professional stature, which maybe can help you get a better job. But in short, these projects are typically way too small for governance. How can we introduce governance into our work? We can do things like have regular meetings, take notes and share them, have an advisory board, make your project easy to join, get feedback, and think about the future. This is not a comprehensive list. This is just a place to start a conversation and some learning. Some of this sounds very boring, but it's a good path for getting to healthier projects in the future. The point I'm trying to drive home is this. We all happen to work in a wonderful programming community. I personally think so, and I don't think that all of us would be at this conference today if we all didn't believe the same thing. Our community exists as an intersection of a bunch of different systems. All of these systems are critical to a healthy programming community. My goal today is to point at these systems and to see them. And we should also ask, how do we keep these systems healthy? And my question for you is, I want you to ask yourself, what's my role in these systems? And what is my company's role? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe governance is not the answer. But if you think so, get involved and show us what you think the right way might be. Mats was saying in the keynote that the only way for Ruby to thrive is for people to get involved. The Ruby community is a mature garden at this point, now in 2022. Many projects are stable, even boring. But it's worth asking how things might be better. And the only way it gets better is if we all pitch in a little, however we can. So in summary, infrastructure is very boring, but very important. We should all think about what makes Ruby world great and help out when we can. And good governance can help build strong infrastructure. Finally, as we have conversations like this about how to improve our community, I want to remember the words of Dr. Meadows. The scarcest resource is not oil, metals, clean air, capital, labor, or technology. It is our willingness to listen to each other and learn from each other and seek the truth rather than seek to be right. I hope I've done a little bit of that today. Thank you very much. Quick thanks to the organizers of Euruko. I know how much firsthand work goes into these conferences, so huge hand for them. None of this is possible without their labor. Also, thanks to the sponsors. As I said in my talk, none of this happens without them. Thanks to my family, and thanks to all of you for listening. I appreciate it.
Adarsh, thank you so much. I'm not going to let you go yet, because when listening to your talk, it was kind of eye-opening. We had a short discussion before about the way Finnish infrastructure works, and especially biking. And for someone, I was born and raised in Helsinki. We don't get as much snow, or it doesn't get as cold as in Oulu up north. But still, when you live here, you tend to think it's normal that like kids in 10 years of age, they bike to school every day. And only when someone points it out, coming from California, you go like, interesting. What makes that possible? So amazing. And also, what you mentioned about the accident assessment panel, I think that's something very Northern European, that every time there's an accident, there's this serious-looking person who, by the way, in Finland, when officials do the public announcements, there's not a cadre of officials behind them being like, yes, yes. But they actually come and very often they speak in plain Finnish and explain what did they found in that case. So absolutely. Great points. I went and Googled the book Thinking in Systems. It has rave reviews in Amazon.
Cool.
And I'm going to let you tell us more. Why should we read it?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think it's really a little bit about how for me, and I think for other people who recommend that book to me, reading that book helps me see the world differently. Like I was saying, this room is filled with all kinds of different systems, and we ignore a lot of them, or we don't think about them, but they all interconnect. This AV system, this mic that I'm working, is dependent on the electrical system, which is probably dependent on the architectural system, which is dependent upon 5 or 10 other things. And it's like you start to see the matrix a little bit, like you start to see all of these things being interacting and how fragile they are. That's the other thing that I think I got out of that, is that all of these things that we depend on are actually really brittle. And when they fail, we think that it's maybe something simple, but it's really all of these things working together in concert.
Yeah, and it's actually, somebody asked me yesterday about the history of the building we're right now. It was built in 1908 by the early labor unions. So this is actually a labor union house where they met. So interesting. What were the systems that brought us there?
Yeah.
Hey, quite a few questions. So let's go there. In terms of governance, which other communities do you admire the most?
Ooh, I had cut this from my talk for length, but luckily I had these slides ready. Because I was curious to know, how do other communities do it? And many, again, a lot of these projects are volunteer run, and so it's not really clear, a lot of people don't have time to put into all of these meetings and notes and decisions and so forth. But there are two that I wanted to highlight. One is Rust, and I really love this. And by the way, this is the Rust homepage. Rust is one of the only programming language websites, and I emphasize websites because I think that's an important official document, that has a top-level governance menu item. And look how big they put it. This was really so beautiful when I saw it. I was so excited. And their process, they outline how they make changes, which is kind of an RFC process. And they also have a roadmap, which I think is unique for a lot of technical projects. They try and say, these are the things we're thinking about in the next year. I have no idea how well any of this works, but I can tell you that this is important to them. And then another one, as Mats mentioned in the keynote in Python, a few years ago, Guido van Rossum was the BDFL for Python, and then he very abruptly resigned. He posted this to the listserv one day in 2018, and the key line here is right here at the bottom. And you will all be on your own. Just out of nowhere, he's like, I'm out. So this surprised a lot of people. So the core team got together and they decided that they wanted to they had to figure out what to do. So they set up a small steering council which designed their own governance. And they have a kind of modified RFC system called the PEP system where they propose changes and discuss it. And this committee now discusses development changes as a group, and they use consensus to move forward. They have elections for this steering committee, and I think they've navigated this transition pretty well. So that's my answer to that question.
Excellent. From, might be an abbreviation, but I'll respect that, AMR. What about the governance of Ruby language specs so that it can be used by other implementation teams?
Can you say that again?
What about the governance of Ruby language specs so that it can be used by other implementation teams?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay.
Whoever asked that question, can they explain a little bit more? Yeah. Yes. Oh, so I think the question was the specification of the language for MRI, how can other Rubies use that, like Truffle Ruby and so on? That's right. Yeah, so the question is, there's other implementations of Ruby, not just MRI. How can they maybe share some governance and learnings? I think that's a great question, and I don't really have a great answer to that. I think that a lot of this comes down to communication. You know, I have this Homer Simpson quote that I've changed, which I like, which is that communication is the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. So I think that all those teams could get together and talk about it. And how to do a better job as a group.
Let's talk about money. What is the best current way for companies to monetarily support Bundler and other core tools? Ruby Together?
Yeah, so Ruby Together exists now as a project inside Ruby Central. I'd say at Ruby Central, we have received some unsolicited support from different organizations and in some cases governments who want to support open source software. As I mentioned, Shopify, we had a great deal with them recently. I think that's probably a good way. I feel weird saying that as a director of Ruby Central, to be out here soliciting, but that is one venue. In fact, I think we in Ruby Central have been figuring out our own governance. We've just hired a new executive director and are putting our own formalisms in place. And I think that we have not been very prepared to take in a lot of support and money previous to now, but we have a lot better structure this year and going into next year. So certainly, you know, we would love to talk about that if somebody's interested in supporting these teams. I'm sure there are other ways too, but maybe that's a good conversation for the hallway.
And I'll make an exception. I'll allow a comment. Your storytelling skills are incredible. Loved how you went from Finland's bike system to Ruby infrastructure. Thank you. Adarsh.